Hey everyone, a nice and short Bible reading tonight. So it's from Mark 1, verse 1. The beginning of the good news of Jesus, Christ, Son of God.
You know, usually I'm really conscious not to get into the singing with too much gusto in case I lose my voice, because that's like occupational hazard. But yeah, I couldn't help it tonight. So hopefully you're going to do just a little bit of the talking tonight, actually. So who was here for our Mark reading last week? Lots of people. I think that the most encouraging comment I heard was someone saying in quite a surprised tone, "Oh, you know, that wasn't as boring as I thought it was going to be." And I thought that was great. Yeah, fantastic. So actually, I wanted to start tonight by just finding out if people. Let me ask a specific question. Do you have a comment, short comment, on how hearing the Gospel of Mark impacted you, or what you noticed as Mark was being read? So something big, something small, or something that particularly hit you. And if you just yell it out, I'll repeat it so that people online can hear. The disciples are dumb. Bit thick. Yeah, okay, so the 2 feedings. Yeah, I thought Cameron did that really well. He's like, haven't we just done this? Yada, 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 yada. Yeah, okay, lots of repetition. It's a really good thing to watch for when you're reading a gospel.
I was quite stunned by the contrast between the time that Jesus spent up near Galilee.
Yep.
And then when he went to Jerusalem, it all just turned a mess.
Yeah, okay, so we very deliberately put the interval where we did. So there's a first half in Galilee where lots of things are happening, and then there's a second half in Jerusalem where, yes, it all goes pear-shaped. Any other comments?
Jesus doesn't say much.
He doesn't say much in Mark. He says a bit. But he's got much longer dialogues in Matthew, Luke and John. Yeah. Which is why we chose Mark, because Mark's 16 chapters. Try fitting the 28 chapters of Matthew in one night. Yeah.
I just think this is how the good news would have been spread originally, orally.
Yes. Yes, okay. So the fact that Mark was read and that we sat and listened to it would have been much closer to what happened originally when the vast majority of the population is not literate. And so Mark and the other Gospels would most likely have been performed just like it was last week. And people would have sat and listened. And what's interesting about that is that, of course, there's no chapters or headings or anything in the original Mark. And so you have to, if you're writing in that, wow, I'm just getting totally off tangent here. Sorry, I'm just slipping into my academic mode. But you have to figure out some other ways of helping the listeners understand where they are in the story. So repetition is one of those, because you can't just go, okay, so chapter 3, here's what's happening now. Yeah, cool. Mark is performed.
Where the momentum of the gospel, there was like an urgency in it and a zeal.
Yeah, okay, so there's a very fast pace to Mark. Yeah, and there's a lot of immediatelys. And then this happened, and then this happened. It's almost like Mark was out of breath or something when he wrote. And that doesn't happen in the other Gospels either. Everything happens. Yeah. All right, time for one last comment. Speak now. Fantastic. Okay. So in the coming weeks, we're going to unpack some of the story of Mark. But tonight we're going to go back to the beginning. We're not going to go through Mark passage by passage because, wow, wouldn't that take a long time because we're only doing the first 7 words tonight. Instead, sometimes you'll get a bird's eye view of Mark. I'll probably do that next week. Sometimes I'll zoom in on a particular passage or little story within the story. Sometimes I'll pick up a theme that runs all the way through Mark. And hopefully doing it like that will help us to really understand the gospel, because that's what we're trying to do, understand the gospel, and understand the gospel according to Mark, because there's other versions as well, but we're interested in the gospel according to Mark. But not just that, but to also raise questions about the implications of Mark's story for us today. So, here we are, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. This was most likely the title of Mark's story. If it is, then the whole story of Mark, the 16 chapters that Cameron read to us, is not the whole story. It is just the beginning of the story. Do you see that? If the title of the story is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God, then what we heard last week was the beginning of a story. And the beginning of the good news is the story of the life and death of Jesus and the mysterious empty tomb that points to the resurrection. But all of that is just the beginning. The good news didn't end with, and the women said nothing to anyone for they were afraid. That's not where the story ends. That's just where the beginning of the story ends. It wouldn't be particularly good news, I think, if the story finished with, and the women said nothing to anyone for they were afraid. The good news continues. It continues in the life of the reader or the hearer of the story. It's a little bit like a choose your own adventure. Remember the days when you could choose your own adventure? You got a novel and there were several different endings. So Mark is a bit like a choose your own adventure. Now that you've heard the beginning, where do you want the story to go next? How are you going to continue the story in your own life? It's not just the beginning, it's the beginning of the good news. And the Greek word that gets translated as gospel or good news, you can translate it either way, is this Greek word euangelion. And in the first century, when Mark was writing, I guess we think of gospel and we think, oh yes, story about Jesus. One of the 4 stories about Jesus in the Bible. But that's not what the word meant when Mark was writing. The word gospel, euangelion, it was a term that was sometimes used to herald the good news of a military victory won. That was a euangelion, a message about a victory won. Or maybe it could be used for a king or a general who brought a war to an end. That's good news, isn't it, when a war comes to an end? Sometimes it was used for the birth of a new king or for the coronation of a king, because that's kind of the start of a new era, and that's good news. And if this good news was about a king that you had given your allegiance to, then it was really good news for you, wasn't it? Because it meant salvation from destruction. Your king has won some victory. That's good news for you. Well, how do we know that this word was used like that? Well, we know because we have some ancient writings that use the word in that kind of way. And 2 of these are particularly interesting for understanding Mark's gospel. Here's an inscription that dates to somewhere around 9 BCE. And this inscription is about Caesar Augustus, the emperor who ruled at the time when Jesus was born. The purpose of this inscription was to let everybody know that Rome it was kind of a decree, a declaration, if you like. It was to let everybody know that Rome was about to adopt a new calendar, and this new calendar would begin the day that Augustus was born. That will be where our calendar starts, the start of a new era. And this inscription, called the Priene calendar inscription, it praises Augustus, referring to him as a god. It says, obviously the English translation of what it says, "The birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the gospel, good news, for the world." That's what this calendar inscription said. The inscription also says that Caesar Augustus was sent as a saviour, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and order all things. More than one copy of this calendar inscription have been found in more than one location in the ancient Near East. And that suggests that this calendar inscription was actually quite well known, as I guess you would expect if an emperor was making some great declaration. So that's the first use of the word gospel that we know of in the 1st century. There's another use of the word gospel in a writing that was very widely read in the 1st century, especially in synagogues, Jewish synagogues right across the empire. And there we've got something that one of Israel's prophets said. Whoops. Whoa. Can we go back? My clicker is only going forwards. There we go. Thank you. So this is another time when this word euangelion gets used, and it is in what we would call our Old Testament. Of course, it was just the Jewish scriptures in the 1st century. And here's what Isaiah, a prophet, had to say. Wrote it a long time ago, but this is widely read in the 1st century. "How beautiful on the mountain are the feet of the gospel messenger, who announces peace, who brings the gospel, the good news, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, 'Your God has just become king.'" So here we've got a Jewish writing that's being read all through the empire as well. So this word gospel, it's found in Isaiah. You can read it in your own Bibles. And Isaiah was writing it in response to a different empire. He didn't live in the Roman Empire. He lived in an empire much earlier, the Babylonian Empire, who had taken the Jewish people into exile. And in this passage, Isaiah is talking about the people being saved by their God, their king, who has overthrown their captors. So we've got these two uses of the word gospel in the 1st century. One used about the emperor and one used about God, the king. Suddenly, Mark's use of the word good news takes on a whole new meaning, doesn't it? In fact, it actually seems like kind of a dangerous word to use. Because in a world ruled by an emperor who uses his power to squash opposition, do you really want to be suggesting that you've got some good news about the beginning of a reign of a king who is coexisting with the emperor? So this word in the very first verse of Mark kind of hints at a rivalry between the rule of God and the rule of Caesar. I can hear some of you who've got those really critical thinking brains, I can hear you thinking, that's a lot to get out of one word, Denise. And I would think that too, except for the next few words. The good news of Jesus, Christ. There's a comma there. We often think of Christ as if it were Jesus' surname. I asked Jess specifically to put a comma in her reading. We think of it like, oh yeah, Jesus Christ, like, Mr. Christ, come in, sit down, would you like a coffee? But Christ isn't a name, it's a title. It's the Greek word that translates the Hebrew Messiah. And Messiah simply means one who is anointed. It actually doesn't mean one who is God or divine or anything like that. It just means one who is anointed, the anointed one. Well, who is anointed? Who are people who are anointed in the Old Testament scriptures that Mark's listeners are using? Kings are anointed. Priests as well, but especially kings. And if we're talking about kings in the Old Testament and this word being used, especially King David, Israel's most famous king, who ruled over God's people back in the glory days of Israel, when no foreign government was ruling them. And many Jews in the first century living under this empire longed for God to send such a king again. And so here, Mark calls Jesus exactly that. He's not Jesus of Nazareth. This isn't the good news about Jesus of Nazareth. This is the good news about Jesus, Christ, King. Is it a good idea, again, is it a good idea to call somebody king when you're living in the Roman Empire? Not so much, unless maybe you want to be crucified, because that's what you do to kings who are trying to get some opposition happening and overthrow the empire. Emperors don't tend to be too favourable towards rival kings. So the term Christ is actually, again, a really subversive title, a very subversive thing to say. How about the next words? Son of God. Well, maybe you immediately think of the Trinity. If you've been brought up in the church and brought up with lots of Christian doctrine, Christian theology, you're like, yep, Son of God, second person of the Trinity. But when we do that, what we're doing is we're reading a later church doctrine, which I'm not at all saying is incorrect, okay? But we're reading a later church doctrine that's been hammered out. We're taking that and we're reading it back onto this first century good news. What does Mark mean by the term Son of God? Well, Son of God is what Israelite kings are called, especially David and David's descendants. So in Psalm 2, God says to David, "You are my son." Not a line out of Star Wars. "You are my son. Today I have become your father." So Israelites' kings, King David is seen as God's son. And God is the king's father. So David is to rule as the Son of God, as God's son, to be his representative on earth, to rule under the authority of this higher king. But here's the kicker, and here is why Mark is just so clever. Son of God is also a term used of Caesar Augustus. Remember the calendar inscription? The god Augustus. The previous emperor, Julius Caesar, was considered to be so favoured by the gods that on his death he became sort of a divine being. There was even a comet that happened across the sky and everyone went, "You see, it's Caesar ascending to the throne." So if Julius Caesar became a divine being, a god, what does that make his adopted son Augustus? Son of God, son of a god. And that's what some Roman coins had printed on them. The head of the emperor with son of a god printed underneath. So, back to Mark and his subversive writings. He gives Jesus the title Son of God, a title that has these two tiers of meaning, King David and the emperor. So Mark, who knows the Jewish scriptures, our Old Testament, inside and out, he knows that, and he also lives in a world governed by the Roman Empire. What is Mark doing here? Is he suggesting that the title of his story is that Jesus is a king, a rival to the Roman emperor? Because again, that's likely to get somebody crucified. Let's look a little bit more at how Mark uses this title, Son of God, in the rest of his story, because it comes up a few times. First, Jesus is called Son of God at his baptism. And the person who uses the term is God. God says to Jesus, "You are my own beloved Son." Sounds familiar, doesn't it? From Psalm 2. "You are my own beloved Son," God says at the baptism. Whenever unclean spirits saw Jesus, at least in these two cases, they fall down before him and they cry out, "You are the Son of God." And then, if you know your Gospels, perhaps you've been brought up in the church and you're aware of this weird incident somewhere in the middle of the Gospel called the Transfiguration, where Jesus starts to glow, his clothes shine, and God says to the disciples, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And in that case, it's a confirmation of Jesus' identity as the one who's appointed as a king. And it's a call to give our allegiance, the disciples to give their allegiance to Jesus as a king. And as we know, to give your allegiance to a different king than Caesar is a dangerous thing to do. You didn't realise Mark was such a dangerous, subversive piece of work, did you? So, God uses the term at Jesus' baptism. Unclean spirits use the term. God uses the term a second time at the transfiguration of Jesus. The last time that the title Son of God is used in Mark and attributed to Jesus, it is a mic drop moment. It's a mic drop moment because of whose lips speak the title. Does anyone know? Anyone remember? The centurion. A centurion, a Roman centurion. One who has sworn allegiance to Caesar Augustus, because that's what you have to do to be in the military, obviously. One who, we're told, when he saw how Jesus died, he said, "Truly, this man is the Son of God." He switches his allegiance from Caesar Augustus, the powerful tyrant sitting on his throne in Rome, surrounded by his powerful and ruthless army. He switches allegiance from that king to King Jesus, a bloodied and beaten man hanging on a cross alone, deserted by his followers. Why would he do that? Mark is a strange and mysterious book with a strange and mysterious message. That is a lot of sermon, isn't it, for the first 5 words? of Mark's Gospel. As I said, I won't do the next 5 words, or we'll be here for a really long time. But what I will say is that the rest of Mark's story unpacks those 5 words. There's the title, and the rest of the story reflects what that title is about, unpacks that title, helps us to understand what it means that we're reading the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God.